Hello there, welcome back to the channel and the first episode in my series where we will be covering aspects of the Dominion. From the Dominion War to the Dominion's inception, what makes the Dominion, what makes up the Dominion, basically the Dominion. Before we get started, like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and let's get started. This video specifically is about the misguided, somewhat, attempt by the USS Valiant to engage a Dominion battleship of unknown name. It's not really clear that the Dominion didn't really name their ships, they probably just gave them serial numbers. The engagement was something of a disaster for the Federation. The power disparity between these two vessels, not to mention the technological difference between the Dominion and the Federation, was staggering. Although Federation tech in a lot of ways was not too dissimilar to that of the Dominion, and they were able to engage their ships, it was notable that several small Jem'Hadar warships could engage a much larger, more heavily armed, more powerful Federation starship like a Galaxy class starship. And I say more powerful because it was only theoretically more powerful. The Dominion's outlying tech and their sheer aggression and dedication and ferocity to warfare outstripped that of even the most militaristic Federation citizens or Starfleet officers. So, going up against the Jem'Hadar for Starfleet was not an easy task. It wasn't even easy for the Klingons. As I said, the technological difference plus the sheer level of aggression and dedication to war was massive. And in this battle, we see an element of human arrogance and how they were used to basically having their own way in the Alpha Quadrant, combined with the ease in which the Dominion was really taking on the Federation. It took overwhelming numbers. But before we get into the battle itself, let's give a bit of a backstory in brief of the two opposing forces here. On the one corner, we've got the USS Valiant, a Defiant Class warship, similar in construction and sister ship to the USS Defiant, the famous vessel under the command of Captain Benjamin Sisko, the commanding officer of Deep Space Nine. This ship was crewed by Red Squad personnel, elite Starfleet officers with special combat training. On the other side, we've got a Dominion Battleship. This vessel was pretty much an unknown. It was a type of heavy marauder the Federation hadn't really seen before. Likely built in the Alpha Quadrant, as it didn't seem to have come through the wormhole with the other ships, this vessel was built as a response to the kind of ships being fielded by the Allies against the Dominion. It's not known if this was a pre-existing class of starship or was designed specifically for Alpha Quadrant combat, but certainly it was a heavy hitter, heavily armed and immensely powerful. And again, to reiterate, more technologically advanced and more combat orientated. Now the Defiant class ship was a pure out and out warship, but so was this, and was enormous. Starfleet typically looks for ways to outthink their enemy. The problem is the Dominion is something of a dark reflection of the Federation, and wasn't exactly stupid itself, and was capable of organized, thoroughly thought out warfare as well. To look at the past, which is the best way to do it in context, Starfleet doesn't always have the most powerful ship around. They're not the most heavily armed, they're not the most tactically orientated. Quite often Starfleet personnel use reason and logic to outthink their enemy. They look for a weakness that can be exploited. They don't just try and pound their enemy into submission like, say, a Klingon might. They always try to outthink and outflank their enemy. That's not to say that Starfleet ships are not powerful, it's just to say that other races sometimes do it better, but that is not the case with the Defiant class. But these being Starfleet officers, they looked for the same method. They realized they were the underdog in this fight. The Defiant class, the Valiant, she ain't a weak ship. She's got teeth. But they're a piranha going up against a great white. And they knew they were the underdog. If they stood any chance, they had to hit it in a tender spot, and that's what they went looking for. They got scans of the ship, and then they fell back on their training, which told them look for a weak point in this ship, and that's what they believed that they found. In the ventral portion of the ship, they found that the metals used would be vulnerable to a certain type of attack. Red Squad were elite, semi-military trained Starfleet personnel, but they were untested. These were young cadets in a sense. In fact, literally, they were cadets put in charge of a powerful warship. Yeah, Starfleet had a lot of faith in them, But in their arrogance, Starfleet felt that fielding untested, if heavily trained, cadets was a good idea. Instead of falling back on more heavily trained and organised military personnel, they relied on these elite units. Now, this was a test, and Red Squad, from the day that the ship's captain was killed, every decision that they made led them to this failure. In their arrogance, they felt they could continue the work started at the beginning of this exercise. They felt that now war was out, being cadets was irrelevant. They were eager to get into the fight. This was avarice and arrogance combining in the perfect storm of stupidity. On the other side, we've got the Jem'Hadar. Unlike humans, Jem'Hadar are a genetically engineered species bred for war. They are stronger, sharper, and more aggressive than humans in general. Like the cadets, they were young. Jem'Hadar are artificially aged. Most Jem'Hadar don't live longer than 10, maybe 15 years. An elder Jem'Hadar is 20. The Vorta, who would have been in command of the ship and maybe a few other positions around the vessel serving as engineers or other such things, mostly are political officers of the Dominion, and the real fighting is done by the Jem'Hadar. But the Jem'Hadar are bred for war. It is literally in their DNA, even more so than a Klingon. They've no honour, no interest in the rules of war or right or wrong. And this ship was a reflection of the brutalistic, harsh beliefs of the Jem'Hadar and the Dominion as a whole, as these vessels were mostly likely designed actually by the founders. This ship was a starship killer. It was a fleet-destroying behemoth of a starship designed to suppress an entire star system on its own if it really wanted to. It had enough firepower and defences to challenge anything in the Alpha Quadrant, and that's what they were going up against. But as much as we know this about it, we also don't know much about its technical capabilities. We don't know how fast it was or anything. And they felt that they had found an exploitable weakness and felt that the Dominion wouldn't have known about this and compensated for it. So that is the two belligerents of this particular engagement. How the battle would take place was a cluster F of bad decisions made mostly by Starfleet to engage this ship. The one voice of reason aboard the Valiant was a civilian personnel and observer that was trying to convince them to turn around and go home, but the charismatic, drug-addicted captain of the ship thought it was a better idea to engage them. They would execute their plan, modifying quantum torpedoes to hit the soft underbelly, which they believed was the weak point of this battleship, causing a cascade reaction which would destroy the entire underside of the ship and have a reaction which would mean that the vessel would either be critically damaged or the ensuing decompression and structural collapse of the vessel would weaken it to the point where the Valiant could finish it off if the vessel didn't outright explode. The variables to this plan are almost too numerous to count, but just to put it in a little bit of obvious ones. The chances of the Valiant actually getting close enough to the ship to fire these torpedoes that it had to fire at near point blank range in order to guarantee it hit its target. There's your first hurdle. The chance is pretty low. This ship is heavily armed and you don't know its full capabilities. You do know it's stronger than you. Its weapons are more advanced than yours and it's got more of them. The next variable to consider. You don't really know this plan's gonna work. You've no backup. There's no alternative plan. If this doesn't work, you've no exit strategy. You don't know how to get away from this ship. You've no ability to hide from this ship. You can't outfight it. You can't outrun it. And you can't hide from it. And in war, generally in combat, you've got three options. Run, fight, or hide. And by engaging this vessel like they did, they sacrificed all three options. Needless to say, between the disorder and anarchy aboard the Valiant, as much as they thought they were in control, they were not, and the discipline and brutality and efficiency of the Dominion's warship and its crew, they never really stood a chance. But they believed that they did, as Nog would eventually put it, and Sisko. And I'm paraphrasing here. Captain Waters, the commander of the ship, who I've done a video on by the way, he may have been a good man, he may even have been a great man, but in the end he was a bad captain who got his whole crew killed in a valiant, pun intended, but futile effort to destroy a threat to the Federation that did need to be eliminated. But what Starfleet really needed was to play to its strengths. Not just heavy hit this thing into submission. Get the data the Valiant gathered back to Starfleet, let them analyze it and come up with a real plan to destroy or neutralize this ship and the threat that it posed. Instead, they learnt that the weakness they thought was not a weakness. The Dominion was stronger than they thought, more resilient than they thought, and although, I'll grant them, it put up an impressive pyrotechnic flow when they hit this damn thing, it didn't do the critical damage they thought. I don't doubt that the ship suffered some damage. There isn't a fireball of that size and an explosion of the ship hurtling through space that big that it didn't take any damage. However, its shields were still up and its weapons still worked and it was still maneuvering, and there was no visible hull breach. They may have burned off an outer layer or something, a bit like a blade of armour, most likely, which like the Defiant had, but the ship carried on kicking, and it kicked the Valiant to death and killed nearly the entire crew with only 3 survivors. This was not the biggest defeat in the Dominion War the Federation would suffer. It was not the biggest victory the Dominion would claim. What it was indicative of the foolish, short-sighted, entitled arrogance that many within the Federation had. They were too used to having things their own way. They weren't used to an enemy anymore that they couldn't negotiate with. Yeah, there was the Borg, but one cube every so often, not so much a problem. This is a completely different enemy, a dark reflection of yourself, a mirror, if you will, of the Federation, which we will explore more in a future video, that had the same level of technical capabilities and but a much higher vicious streak than you. Starfleet's usual strengths weren't going to save them in this war. And this battle was a microcosm of what was happening across the Federation as Starfleet officers scrambled to remember the things that they had effectively put aside through decades of peace and the Golden Age. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now, and in the description box below there are links to my other social media accounts.